Well, thanks very much, and thanks for taking the time in your busy lives to listen on a Thursday evening. What I want to do is I want to rehearse a number of themes that I think are quite important for understanding the way that fear works and what fear is all about. And in particular, what I want to do is to focus on what I think are the specific cultural and social dynamics that are at play at the moment. I think one of the ways in which you can see the distinct feature of fear and the way it works is if you take the existing pandemic that we have, and if you compare that to the greatest pandemic of all in modern times, which was the smallpox pandemic that kicked in around 1918. What's interesting about it is that although the 1918 pandemic was really devastating, you have something between 45 and 50 million people dying from it, and it was all over the world. It was a pandemic that was rarely discussed. And in fact, it was never discussed by politicians. So for example, the American President Wilson never made a single statement about the smallpox pandemic, and other prime ministers and politicians left the handling of the pandemics to people working in the domain of health and just kept out of it. And in general, there was no lockdown, schools didn't close, churches didn't close, life went on. What you had was a situation where people were concerned about the death rates and people dying, but by and large, its impact on everyday life was absolutely minimal compared to the impact that COVID has on ours, even though COVID, the coronavirus, and its effect on our health and in terms of its death rate is thankfully far, far lower. And I think what you're gonna sort of think about is that it's unimaginable that Prime Minister Johnson would simply not make a statement about the coronavirus, that the government would just carry on, everybody would just carry on, leaving the discussion of the pandemic to a small number of scientists or experts. And it seems to me that one of the reasons why there is this big change is because the way that we regard the threats to our lives, the way that we regard our safety and our security has fundamentally changed. And the way we fear and the way we become anxious about the problems that threatens us is influenced by a number of cultural factors that are quite unique to our circumstance. I don't think there's ever been a time in human history where fearing had the kind of character that it has today, mainly because what has happened in our lifetime is that fearing has ceased to be an accomplishment that is focused on a specific threat. It's not about fearing the lion that's coming to eat you. It's not about fearing an invasion of locusts. It's not about fearing the fact that your house might get burned down. Fearing is something that exists without an object. We just fear. It's almost as if we fear fear itself, and it's become an important element in the way that we exist and the way that we kind of function. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, as I indicated earlier on or suggested earlier on, different cultures have different regimes of fear. Different cultures fear different things. And the intensity of fearing and the meaning that we attach to fearing is also very, very different. I mean, just to give you a very simple example, there used to be a time when fearing was seen as a very positive, moral way of dealing with the world. So in the English language, we have the expression, a God-fearing man. A man that fears God is, by definition, a positive individual. Fearing God is a respectable way, a moral way of being. And in fact, in the ancient Hebrew language, the word for religion was, the synonym was the equivalent of fear of God. So you can see that in that context, fearing has a very different moral meaning than it has for us, where by and large, when we talk about fear, and the pervasiveness of fear, that is seen as unbalanced and negative, dysfunctional way of proceeding. Now, I think that there is a number of reasons for that. And I think the most important reason has got to do with culture. Historically, the way that people fear is mediated through a web of meaning, which tells people about life. What a web of meaning is, what a cultural web of meaning is a kind of system of ideas that explain to us what is good and bad, what is sinful, what is sacred. It tells us how to behave, what kind of customs to follow. And in many ways, the way that I see culture and its web of meaning, it's a bit like the glasses that I wear. Through the glasses that I put on, I see things with a certain degree of clarity. If I take it off, then that clarity disappears. Things become a little bit unfocused, and I'm a little bit less sure. And I think what has happened in our world is that our web of meaning has, to some extent, become very weak and has become extremely fragmented. And the way you can tell that is that we no longer have a consensus in Anglo-American societies about what is right and wrong. Some people think that abortion is a choice, an important positive choice. Others say it's murder. Some people think that sovereignty of a nation is important. Other things that globalism is important. We have huge discussions about moral questions all the time, and the whole culture wars that surround us, including the culture wars around speech, are very much related to the fact that there is no common sort of web of meaning through which we give meaning to human experience. And when that occurs, when our web of meaning has become a bit weaker, then the way we fear also alters. For a start, one of the ways in which we're able to manage our fears is by solidarity. The more that communities feel at one, the more we identify with each other's problems, the more that we watch each other's back, the less we have to fear. To give you an example, if I'm on my own, nobody's watching my back, and I go to a new town, I go into a pub, and I look around and see all these strangers looking at me because I'm a new person there, I will feel a little bit intimidated. I will feel a little bit wary of what's going on. And I will be looking around my shoulders. If, on the other hand, I go into that same pub with 10 of you, all of us kind of talking and laughing and looking after each other, then we don't fear the circumstances that we're in. That pub is immediately transformed into a friendly and hospitable environment. So these things do matter. The web of meaning, solidarity, and in particular, where meaning becomes really important is in many respects one of the fundamental questions of our time, which we very rarely discuss, which is that of uncertainty. The world is very uncertain. We don't know how things are going to pan out. And being able to deal with uncertainty, being able to deal with the new problems that are thrown up, is one of the challenges that society faces. Now, in some circumstances, some societies are very good at dealing with uncertainty. Some of the most robust, creative societies are also the ones that almost embrace uncertainty, embrace risk, and really roll with it. I'm thinking, for example, historically of Athens, where democracy was discovered in ancient times, which was, the Athenians were the most risk-taking culture around at that particular time. And I don't think it's an accident that it was their lack of fear that opened them up to the idea of democracy and of giving people the right to vote. Another culture that's very much pro-uncertainty and tries to manage it and make it work for them was Renaissance city-states in Italy, who basically developed the idea of not giving in to fortuna meaning fate, but giving a greater amount of confidence to people's ability to control their lives, to in a sense, to exercise their autonomy. And you find that in Renaissance Italy, you have this very creative moment where uncertainty is not kind of something that you become scared about, but uncertainty is something that you see as an opportunity to make things happen. Now, in our world, uh, things have fundamentally changed because in our culture, uncertainty and taking a risk have acquired very negative connotations. I remember when I was a child growing up in East Europe, my dad always just used to say to me, "Hey, Frank, why don't you take a risk? It's a good risk. Why don't you go for it?" In those days, you had good risks, you had bad risks, and you had in between what we just don't know. Well, these days, there is no such thing as a good risk. According to our culture, taking risk is almost synonymous with irresponsibility. So because of that kind of mental outlook that we've adopted, where we are wary of uncertainty, we're scared of taking risk, we think that taking risk is on balance something to be avoided. What we also have is the fear of the future. Obviously, if you got these attitudes about uncertainty, the way you regard future is principally in very, very negative terms. And I think those elements are really quite important, because if you don't believe in the future, you're not confident about what's going to happen, then you become much more inclined to worry about the world that surrounds us. And one of the things that we see at the moment is that because of that, we have a new definition of threat. We have an inflated definition of threat, where we essentially don't just simply talk about something being a problem or something being a threat. We increasingly use the word existential threat. The number of times we use the concept of existential threat is incredible. We talk about the existential threats posed by asteroids hitting the Earth, the existential threat posed by pandemic, by global terrorism, by global warming. In other words, the number of times we talk about human existence being threatened has kind of expanded in recent years, to the point at which just about everything that is a little bit dangerous can be seen in those terms. And our language has changed to kind of make us sensitive to threats that in the past would have been seen as not particularly worrying in an entirely different way. Just give you one example that you might be familiar with. When I was your age, when I was an undergraduate at university, we talked about storms. We talked about the weather not being very nice. We talk about hailstorms and snow hitting a particular country, but we did not have a concept of extreme weather. If you think about it, it's an interesting idea. The idea of extreme weather is now used on weather channels and elsewhere. The BBC talks about a storm hitting Kent or Sussex, and they will use the expression extreme weather. But what they are really talking about is that it's not going to be particularly pleasant or nice. It's going to be very, we're going to get very wet, and we're not going to have very much sunshine. But the language that we talk in now is always in extremities, in extremely heightened and inflated terms. So we have what is a very much a kind of inflation of the threats that kind of confront us, that we refer to time and time again. Some of you might be familiar with the way in which campus safety has become an issue. I don't know, I wish I could see your faces, whether you understand what I'm talking about, but I remember that there was a time when campus safety referred to the safety of the infrastructure and buildings. It was very rarely used. Whereas these days, when you arrive on campus and you go to your freshers and when you have all these various discussion, safety is talked about as, in kind of expansive terms. And very often you think that on campuses, the minute you arrive, you're going to get harassed, you're going to get bullied, you're going to be beaten up, you're going to face all kinds of negative experiences, and you need to be prepared for this idea, and forgetting the fact that the campuses in our country are the safest environments that one can imagine. And it's because we have this idea that things are not safe, that somehow things are not safe, that you have the emergence of concepts that you're probably familiar with, like safe space. 10 years ago, nobody talked about safe spaces. And then a few people began to talk about safe spaces here and there. And when they meant a safe space, they meant a room where you could go into. And if you were gay or lesbian, you could talk to other gay and lesbian people, not having to account for yourself in front of heterosexual people. And that's all it was. Since that time, safe spaces have mushroomed, not just on campuses, but elsewhere. And when you think about it, when you pause for 1 second and think the meaning of safe space, which I call a quarantine from criticism, from being under pressure from other people, the very idea of a safe space implies that everything outside of that space is unsafe, is inherently unsafe. And I think this obsessiveness that we've acquired about safety in 21st century Anglo-American society is very, very unique. And I could go on and talk about it, give you loads of examples in the way in which it kind of alters our life in the most minute kind of a way, the way that human relationships have altered, relations at work, where we become almost encouraged to become distant from one another. I think that one area where all these trends really kick in is in relation to freedom. Now, I noticed up there that there's a little sign that says, liberate the debate. And presumably, when you're talking about liberating the debate, you're alluding to the importance of free speech, of free expression, of freedom itself. And I think that one of the reasons why so many people are not particularly interested in freedom. In fact, I can think of myself, when I was an undergraduate, we used to spend most of our time expanding the domain of freedom. Now, most of the energy goes into limiting it. And of course, the reason for that is because freedom is a very risky phenomenon. I mean, when you give people freedom, you got no idea where things are going to end up in. Freedom is, by definition, sort of an encouragement for people to live in accordance with their inclinations and exercise their autonomy. And you have no idea what kind of dynamic that will set in. So isn't it better if instead of allowing people to be genuinely free, we introduce rules? And one of the most important growth industries in Britain is the making of rules. I mean, the number of micromanaged rules we have on campuses and workplaces about, when you can do what. Like in my university, we had this bizarre situation where I go into my office and all the secretaries are looking at a filing cabinet and not moving it. I say, well, why don't you move it? It says, that's not our job. Health and safety says we cannot move it. So I say, I'll move it. And they say, no, you can't do that, Professor Furedi. I said, okay. I come back a few days later, it's still there. So I say to myself, look, I live in a free world, I exercise my freedom. So I said, I don't care whether I'm allowed or not, but I'm just going to move this filing cabinet because it's in the way of everybody. And the very idea that people were prepared to put up with this token of safety, of the symbol of safety, because of the rules that it indicates that we don't take our freedoms to behave very, very seriously. Now, one of the interesting things that occurred is not only freedom risky, but freedom is increasingly conceptualized as dangerous. And if you've been looking at the discussion, the academic discussion on free speech or the exercise of voice, increasingly what you have are a series of propositions which suggest that the expression of free speech is dangerous or potentially dangerous because it not only offends people and therefore it devalues their esteem and hurts them, it is also traumatizing and can potentially make people feel psychologically ill and create mental health problems. Now just think about it, because in one sense, we all know that speech can have negative consequences for individuals. But of course, whether or not it has got negative consequences is not based upon the content necessarily of that speech, but upon the relationships that people have. For example, I remember as a young man being totally hurt and offended when somebody called me buck-teeth Furedi because of my teeth not being particularly nice. And that was something that actually hurt. So it is right that speech hurts, and it hurts in all kinds of different ways. But that has never been seen as a reason for curbing it, for limiting it, and ultimately for pathologizing it in the way that it has occurred in the present moment. And I think that when we get to the point at which our culture of fear begins to call into question the exercise of freedom, then we're in big trouble. Because I don't know if any of you studied philosophy or political theory, but if you did, you will have come across the probably the greatest English philosopher in the modern era, Thomas Hobbes, whose Leviathan, this kind of big absolutist ruler, was justified on the grounds that people were prepared to trade in the need for security, the need for safety, for freedom. I give up my freedom in order to be secure. That was the argument. And whatever you think about Hobbes, he really raised this issue in a very striking, very, very clear way. And we can see today that this trade-off between security and freedom has become really quite important, because in a culture that allows safety and fear to have such a prominent, incredibly strong role, it's inevitable that the impulse, the imperative of security is always going to have the last word. So when I'm arguing with somebody, as I often do, when I give a lecture, somebody can come back and say, I'm scared by the way you're behaving, because the words you're using is really making me feel uncomfortable or making me feel traumatized or offended. And where my inclination is to say, grow up, deal with it, learn to deal with the fact that anything that's interesting and complex and difficult and challenging is sooner or later going to hurt somebody. So we have to deal with it. Instead, what we do is we give in to our fears, and we end up with these rule books about what words you can use, what words you cannot use, sort of when you can speak and to whom and in what kind of context. So I want to suggest to you finally that in the end, the culture of fear and the way we regard it is really going to have very big impact on freedom. I just want to end up on one last small point, which is that the consequence of everything that I'm saying is to change and is to alter the very meaning of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a person. Because what the culture of fear does is it kind of creates a situation where there's an assumption that you and I do not have the moral and the intellectual resources to deal with risk and uncertainty. You and I are, by definition, powerless. And in the English language, we invented a new word through which these sentiments are expressed. A word you're very familiar with, a word you probably think has always existed, but certainly when I was an undergraduate, nobody used it. And that word is vulnerable. These people are, we have vulnerability. These people are really vulnerable. And therefore we have got to protect them, insulate them from the experience of everyday life. Until the 1970s, late 1970s, vulnerability was only used in relation to physical objects like bridges. Vulnerability was used in relation to the environment, and the environment having the resilience to deal with problems. And for the first time it was used was in the late 70s, early 80s in relation to babies. Since then it's expanded. And the very fact that we use the word vulnerable so often as a marker for our powerlessness, and we define ourselves very often as being in that state of vulnerability, indicates the impact that the culture of fear has on our lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think I at least very much Very much enjoyed that talk. Again, it feels weird when you finish up like that. I feel like we should all be giving you a massive round of applause, but that's really hard. So now I think we're going to just jump straight into the Q&A. So the way I'm going to do it is the same as normal for those of you who've been here before, but those of you who haven't, I'm going to give a quick rundown. So in the participants tab of Zoom, you all should be able to, if you click on more, there should be like a little thumbs up, thumbs down, or a little hand wave emoji. So if you'd like to ask a question, just click either that or like the yes little emoji, and I'll know to come and unmute you. So yeah, anyone who wants to ask a question, please feel free. And if not, in fact, I might be selfish because I've got one that I want to start off with, so I might ask you that first. So I was going to say, it seemed very much towards the end yet, you were talking about this kind of idea that society currently has possibly lower expectations for people nowadays than they would have had sort of 30, like even sort of 10 or 20 years ago. Would you say that's an accurate characterization?
It is. I mean, just to explain it in a university context, sort of when I did my PhD, I decided to do my PhD on the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. And I went to Kenya at the age of 21 to do field research in some of the communities where the Mau Mau fighters, were located. And I went there for a year. I was completely out of contact. I think I wrote 2 postcards to my mom, but nobody knew where I was. And that was like, to me, an incredible educational experience where I was allowed the freedom to deal with what is a very new and, to me, a very uncertain situation, and just get on with the task of doing my research. Today, my PhD students or PhD students in most British universities would not be allowed to do that. They would not be allowed. First of all, when you make a proposal for PhD research, you have to make a risk assessment. You have to get the approval of an ethics committee. And certainly in my university, we would advise people, if you're going to go, you should have somebody who's in contact with you. You got to check back with us every single week. You got to do this and that. And by and large, a lot of the research, some of the most creative, important research in my area of sociology could no longer be done because of the fact that we have risk assessment strategies. We have safety rules about how you conduct research. And it would mean, for example, like in sociology, criminology, we used to have guys go to Chicago to hang out with gangsters for a year, go to the same bars, talk to them, interview them. And a lot of criminology was based on, essentially hanging out with criminals. Now imagine how Sussex University, any university would react when somebody proposes that. They would say no. And I'm just using these examples to indicate that our expectations of students of being able to handle pressure and challenges and of dealing with uncertainty has fundamentally altered in a way that I think is very much to the detriment of the development of knowledge and the development of ideas.
So there's been like a sort of noticeable kind of degrading in like the quality of research, especially in sort of fields more like yours, like sociology.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I think that that also relates to something. I mean, you guys might think very differently being students, but for me, one of the most creative things that an academic can do in a seminar or a lecture situation is putting students under pressure, right? So like in my seminars, everybody speaks, sort of, because they have to, they understand that's part of the contract. And in my seminar, sort of, I use the Platonic method of teaching, where after you give an answer, I usually say, are you sure why? which then forces you to account for it. And then I might say that 2 or 3 times. And after a while, I can see some students are getting extremely, faces are getting red because they're really under pressure. And that kind of teaching today in America is called academic bullying, because basically what academics should do is I should make you feel comfortable, and I should make you feel good about yourself and relaxed, rather than putting you under pressure. And I think it's not that I'm a bad person. I like giving people a hard time. It's just that the road to knowledge and the way that you and any other student gains intellectual independence, the only way you get intellectual independence, where you can think for yourself, is when that kind of relationship of pressure kicks in.
Right, thank you. I see Luke wants to ask a question, so Luke, I'll unmute you there.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for the talk, by the way. It was really interesting. Just to kind of link to what you were saying there about, the best thing a professor can do in a seminar environment is to put people under pressure. I feel like as like a first year just coming to uni, I think the online sort of style of, people can literally turn their cameras off. It makes people like even less willing to talk. And I think like, I don't know, maybe it's just, it's COVID. There's not a specific reason why we're using social media more, but I feel like that sort of trend of teachers being hesitant to pick on people, even though it's doing them good in the long term, I feel like maybe it's going to get worse and worse because of social media, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of problems. The truth is that in the present context, we are forced to use the social media, but not nearly as much as we do. I mean, some of the academics that I respect are doing face-to-face teaching at the moment. I mean, sometimes they're the only ones in their department because, that's their vocation, And the reason why they're doing face-to-face meetings is not because they haven't got a social life and they've got to hang out with people, but very much because, unlike in schools, in an academic environment, the relationship that you have is really quite important. That interactive relationship is really quite important because I only get to know your strengths and your weaknesses in the course of directly, physically engaging with you, eye contact and everything else. I mean, I can often, because I'm experienced, I know almost immediately when you don't understand what I've just said. I know immediately when you disagree. I can tell more or less most of the time whether you kind of get the point. And those are really important elements in an academic relationship, because if I can see that I'm losing you, I'll rephrase the problem in a different way. I'll backtrack and I'll kind of try to say the same thing in a different way. And that's what's creative about an academic relationship. That's also, you might not know this, in a real genuine academic encounter and relationship, the academic also learns, and one of the ways, for example, I learn when I'm talking to students is when they don't understand what I'm saying. Because when they don't understand what I'm saying, I can say one of two things. I can either say they're stupid, which is very rarely the case, or I can say that I didn't explain myself properly. There's a logical leap that I made. Maybe I got to go back and rethink, this kind of complex issue that I'm trying to communicate. So I'm learning all the time in a kind of creative academic environment. I would not have become an academic, if I couldn't have that kind of relationship, because, I would then just become somebody that stays at home and writes books. There will be no need for any of that. So we are depriving ourselves of something very, very important. And hopefully when this whole business finishes, we can get back to a situation where this can come to an end. But unfortunately, the ethos in our universities is one where it's pedagogically, we have a much lower expectation of students. And that's something that, I think most of you will have picked up, and hopefully most of you will do what you can to challenge it.
Yeah, I mean, like in secondary school and college level, I mean, obviously they can track participation and if you showed up, but in uni, like I know people in my seminars that haven't showed up for the last 6 or 7 ones, and it doesn't seem like, I mean, maybe there are reasons, obviously, but if there are, it doesn't seem like the teachers are really encouraged to reach out to them.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, next question is coming from Ayrton.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your talk. It was very, very interesting. I have a little bit of an ironic question here. Do you fear for the current state of universities in a way in regards to the sort of safe space culture? Because this is going to get a little bit anecdotal here, but I found that a lot of the classes I attend and sort of the culture around campus doesn't really encourage free thinking as such. The idea that university is somewhere you go to challenge your ideas and learn and develop. I've been chastised and harassed and, quite frankly, bullied by a lot of people on my course because I dare to, I've changed my political beliefs over time. From the more I've learned, I'm now a third year, my beliefs are completely irreconcilable from where I was at the beginning of uni. They're completely different from where they were a year ago. I've been sort of pushed out by that. It's this general idea that you have to maintain the same ideas, that you can't change, you can't adapt, and you're not learning. And that seems, at least to me, irrevocably tied to the idea of safe space culture. So I'd just like to know what you think of that, and do you worry for the state of universities in the way that this seems to be going?
I do. I am worried about the fact that there is a kind of very powerful impulse towards conformism, that in many universities, you can only have one narrative, and that's all there is. And very often when I talk to academics on a number of questions, they will basically, there's no two sides to this debate. Right? This is it. I was discussing the question of J.K. Rowling being canceled at a seminar recently. And some of the people turned on me and said, Frank, the trouble with you is you think that the issues raised by Rowling can be debated, but she's wrong. And what she said is immoral. And I don't think that we have to discuss and debate that. We're done with that. And to me, the idea that debate is now something that you got to beg for. And when you want to have a debate, when you argue, people regard you as some kind of a kind of academic pariah, speaks to a kind of culture where ideas are really not that important. Because if ideas were really important, then people want to fight over them. They would want to struggle to get clarity over them. They would want to struggle to get understanding about them. And to do that, you have to argue. One of the creative dimensions of arguing and debating is it's not that you hear your own voice and that's lovely. Is that it's through the engagement with other people, arguing, that you really learn what you really think. I don't know if any of you ever experienced this, where you actually thought you knew what you were thinking, but then you were confronted by somebody else who basically says, something very different, and you force to rethink what you kind of started out with. So in that sense, debate is important because it's the most creative way in which we develop intellectually. And I think at the moment I am worried about academia being both fairly sloppy as far as standards are concerned, and also its hostility to open debate. And I think the two are connected. And the way they're connected is that in both instances, there is a lack of seriousness, a lack of valuation, which is given to ideas.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question is coming from Ellie.
Hello, thank you very much for coming to talk to us. So I study medicine, and I think a lot of the teaching is still pretty like old school from the surgeons, where they kind of go by the humiliating people and putting you on the spot and kind of bullying people. And I do think it is effective for a lot of people, but also I don't think it's like a one size fits all thing. And I think that style of like teaching is quite damaging to a lot of people. And I do think, I don't know, I would like to see some kind of middle ground where we protect freedom of speech, but we also do acknowledge that people do have vulnerabilities, and not everyone's going to be having a good day, going to be able to kind of cope with certain things and certain times, and some people have certain things going on. And also I want to know how we as a freedom of speech society can also reach out to people who see Liberate the Debate as an unsafe space. And I don't know how we can facilitate expanding the principles more like widely throughout the university space.
Yeah, I mean, as it happens, I've got a lot of friends who've gone through the experience that you've gone through in medical school, and I'm by no means advocating, kind of crude ways of kind of pushing people around and asserting your authority in a very kind of silly kind of a way, which often happens in particularly by surgeons, as it happens. I don't know why that is. So that's not what I'm talking about. Pressure, and to me, pressure is not bullying. It's not about, the aim of pressure is not to make people feel bad about themselves, nor is it about making people do things that they don't want to do. What pressure does, and I'm sure you must have experienced that, there were situations you were in where you stretch yourself way beyond in other situations where I'll give you the most stupid example I can think of. I work out every day. Right? I'm completely obsessed with gyms. And when I go to the gym, my personal trainer gets me to do things that I never do on my own at home. Like now, in lockdown, I still work out, but I go easy on myself, not because I want to, but because there really isn't that kind of extra kind of creative pressure. Come on, Frank, come on, Frank, you're getting, there isn't that kind of thing that is kind of going on. And similarly with our ideas, with our imagination, sort of, we need other people around us to question us, sort of not to rest on our laurels. We need people to point out where we messed up or where we're not clear. And that can hurt. That can hurt, especially when when you kind of go into a seminar room and you have a certain image of yourself, or what's going to happen, a kind of fantasy of how it's all going to work out, which is then punctured by the discussion. And I think that, even if you have a bad day or whatever, we got to learn to live with that, because that's what will give us the resources, the moral, intellectual resources to stand on our 2 feet, to think for ourselves, and not have to rely on anybody to hold our hands, but to, to me, that's the buzz. Intellectual independence means that, you are your own person, and you no longer have to have played that kind of, that's kind of subordinate role. So I think that's what I would say about teaching. It's not about being a horrible person. It's about systematically raising expectations, expecting the most, sort of, and working according to that script. I think that free speech at the moment often has a very negative connotation for a variety of reasons. I think that people who believe in free speech have culturally lost the argument, more or less. I think there's an element of cowardice that has happened over the generations recently. People have been too ready to give in. I mean, I was really horrified, for example, when that French teacher got beheaded, how people in this country just looked the other way and didn't think. It's almost like some of them were murmuring he had it coming to him. So there is that kind of context within which we are operating. But it seems to me the way you get across that is to get across the idea that actually free speech is a very creative buzz. That free speech is one of the most exciting ways in which personal relations, sort of emerge and kind of really crystallize in a positive kind of a way. So we got to make free speech exciting. So the point is, and we got to be fairly open to all kinds of voices who may have a different way of using that free speech. Because the key thing is not what people say, not what they use it for, but the very fact that they're living freely. So what I try to do in my own work is not just talk about free speech and debate, but talk about the creative, transformative dimension of living freely. I mean, living freedom is what it's really all about, living freedom. It's when you feel free to express yourself in line with your inclination, and you kind of project that onto a scene, that the exciting and the kind of creative sort of force that is contained within the freedom of expression kind of really kind of comes out. And I think if we are excited about free speech as individuals in our persona, I think that can be quite infectious, particularly to first years, many who are very idealistic. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to meet first years this year. But usually I find with undergraduate is when they come to university, they're really idealistic. They want to change the world. By the time they get to year 2, they become old men and old women, sort of know how to play the game. I think idealistic young people can be very easily made excited if we kind of think about ways and means of creating that kind of dynamic.
Oh, thank you very much. I was just going to say, you were talking a lot about this kind of culture regarding free speech at the moment. You were saying earlier you had some people in a seminar who were saying in regards to the J.K. Rowling thing, she is just wrong. What would be your advice to people who are sort of our age who would disagree with that? Maybe people like us at the Great Debate. What would be your advice when talking to those kind of people to try and convince them that these things aren't set in stone? Like, what have you found to be the best way to go about that?
Well, I'll give you an example. I had a PhD, a law student, come to me precisely with that question, because he had this experience where he basically said, he was talking to his lecturer, law lecturer, and he said to the law lecturer, I'm not really sure about the law on gay marriage. I can see the arguments on both sides. I can see the arguments for gay marriage, very kind of compelling arguments that are being put forward so that people who love each other can get married. And I can see the arguments against it, also very compelling, where people feel that kind of marriage devalues what marriage is in their eyes. And he said that what happened was that when he kind of raised this puzzle that he had, his lecturer turned on him and he said, look, Martin, there is no two sides to this argument. There's only one position on this, right? And the very fact that you see another view and legitimate the other view is wrong, if not evil. So that's the problem we're dealing with. And I think that the way around that, the way you kind of confront that is, first of all, to get the point across that it's, even if you think that a particular propositions are wrong, right? The content of those arguments cannot be dismissed simply as evil, right? We're not in a morality play. The contents of that argument might be wrong, but in the very course of arguing and criticizing and being faced by their criticism, society learns, has an opportunity to learn. And if you don't allow that to occur, then what you're doing is you're depriving people, students and others, from the opportunity to listen to these things and learn from them and decide for themselves where they stand in relation. In other words, in a very paternalistic way, what you're doing is what parents do with 3-year-olds when they basically use the expression, not in front of the children. You know, I remember my dad occasionally would put his hands over my eyes when there was a sex scene on television that I wasn't allowed to see. In other words, we're infantilizing adults. That's what this argument is really all about. And we got to get that point across. Are we grown-up people, or are we just children? I think that's really quite important. And I think the other point I always use is that heretical ideas, or ideas that are seen as being utterly wrong at one point, sometimes turn out to be the mainstream view, you know, a couple of decades down the road. And it seems to me that those kinds of arguments that basically say that debate is unconditional. You cannot say that there is a single subject that is beyond debate, because if you say that, what you're saying is that debate per se is dangerous. You cannot have a situation where you can debate about this and that topic, but not about that, in that kind of selective way, without undermining the moral authority, the moral status of debate itself.
Right, thank you very much for that. Any more questions from anyone in the chat? Just shove that little emoji on and I can come to you and unmute. But if not, if everyone has said everything they want to say, I think it's getting on for about an hour now since we started. So I think there would probably be a good space to wrap up. Professor, I will ask before you go, if you have any questions for me about the society or anything like that, then you can feel free to ask that now.
Well, just, I mean, what is your big concern at the moment in terms of moving forward?
At the moment, definitely more in regards to what we were just talking about in that question just now. The sort of culture, like you said earlier about sort of the argument surrounding free speech, you were saying that perhaps the argument's been lost surrounding free speech. I guess we're a bit more dogged and maybe a bit more stubborn in that sense, and we're still trying to win it. But yeah, definitely, especially around somewhere like Sussex, trying to foster a more kind of open and more understanding like space in regards to free speech, just people being more open to accepting other ideas, more empathetic of other people's positions, I think is the main goal at the moment.
Yeah, I think you might want to see and use humor. I think humor works quite a lot. As long as it's very important that you guys don't come across as being, you know, sort of complacent or self-satisfied, or that we know better than anybody else, kind of, you know, screw you, you know, kind of, the people understand
Right.
that, you know, you genuinely are interested in what you're doing, and you think that this, you know, this is something that is exciting. I mean, I think getting those things across, I think is really quite important as a way of stimulating people, and at least asking, even if they don't agree with you, at least raise doubts in people's minds. I think that's, the more doubts we can raise, the more open people become to arguing or listening to other people arguing.
Nice. I think Ayrton's back and he just wants to ask one more question. So I think if that's okay with you, we'll let him ask it and then probably wrap up there.
Okay.
Hi, in a similar vein to what Tom was saying, we're still trying to, you know, show ourselves to be we just want to, you know, talk about free speech. We just want to talk about things. We just want to have fun, want to have an open dialogue. But especially at Sussex, there is a really large barrier to entry. You might not believe this if I told you this, but there have been times where I've been talking to people on campus and saying, "Oh, you should come to LTD. You'll, you know, it's a really good time. You should enjoy it. You know, you're a very you know, well-versed person in politics. I study politics, of course. I'm talking to people who also study it a lot, and then quite often they get a funny look on their face, and then eye me with some suspicion. They'd be like, "Oh, you know, what's the matter?" They'd say, oh, LTD, Liberate the Debate, that's full of neo-Nazis, isn't it? Which, of course, is absolutely not true. But the amount of people that have said things like that is utterly astounding to me. And, yeah, I don't know what you make of that.
Well, I mean, I think that's very unfortunate, but there are ways around that. I think that you might want to have, I don't know whether you have organized meetings or discussions on topics like heresy. Maybe look at some of the witch hunts that have occurred in the past. Maybe you want to look at some case studies where the free speech of left-wing or radical people was kind of shut down, because I think, you know, free speech and censorship is used in all kinds of different ways, and, you know, sort of, so it becomes very difficult to label you people as Nazis or fascists or alt-right or whatever, just because, you know, it seems to me that people who are really into free speech must have some open-minded, tolerant, liberal kind of, I mean, liberal in the classical sense, you know, sort of kind of ideals. And I think that projecting that, you know, sort of is really quite important. Obviously, there are a lot of prejudiced people, and there's nothing you can do about it. But if you can try to get at people who are interested in ideas and arguments, I think that's the way to kind of go forward. I mean, I'm actually quite optimistic as to how much a relatively small number of intelligent, motivated students can achieve, you know, sort of, if they kind of begin to find ways and means of giving some kind of expression to their creative powers.
No, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks very much as well. Good night.
Thank you very much, Professor. Have a lovely night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.